Welcome back to the Creator Spotlight podcast. My guest today is Ernie Smith, a writer perhaps best known these days for his long-form newsletter, Tedium, which he's been running since 2015. Tedium is a near decade-old newsletter covering, I quote you, the boring side of the internet. For example, back in 2016, you wrote 1,800 words about the invention of cheese curls. And today you have, I think, around 12,000 subscribers. You send it out, I believe, thrice a week. Before we get into it, did I miss anything within all that?
I've been kind of shaking up a little bit. Sometimes it's 3 times a week nowadays. I'm doing less longer form stuff with the newsletter. I'm still doing a long form piece every week. I'm doing a couple of shorter pieces. It's just for sake of sanity, I guess.
Yeah, the sanity bit is hard. We'll get into that a little later when we talk about mid-range, I think. But one of the pieces you shared with me before this that I really liked is from 2020, and you were decrying the loss of the freedom to customize our spaces online. And so I'm going to read a paragraph from near the end that I think sums up the thesis really well. So you said, what we're left with, because we can't screw with the HTML or tweak settings in the design, are social networks in which engagement rather than individuality is valued above all else. If you want to do truly creative, additive things, you may feel like you have to do them on other networks and simply mention them on Facebook or Twitter rather than letting that creativity happen on the platform itself. Which I agree. And so, like, one way to do that is just to go to a newsletter platform. But you have coded your entire newsletter. You've kind of MacGyvered it together, the entire structure, I believe, and set up yourself. So we'll go back to a bit of that customization bit in a second. But tell me more about like I get why you coded your own thing. So you could have full ownership and it becomes cheaper to access like the services on the back end to send emails, etc. But how much work went into that? Like how long did it take you and how much work does it take to like maintain something like that? I'm not a very technical person, so I just don't know.
I would say that one of the nice things about doing something like this is that when you build it, for the most part, it stays in place. Like,
Mm,
obviously, you still need to like do your own upgrades and like do a little bit of maintenance here and there. But I think that when it comes down to it, I built out like a view for pulling in my newsletter issue so that when I publish, the issue will actually run, will actually build like a full email newsletter version, like
mm,
with the code already done. And I load up this view, and when I hit that page, like all that work is done for me. Whereas when I started, like I think I used MailChimp very early on.
mhm.
Like I remember the hard part of doing all this was that I had to deal with those templates, like these visual templates that were just like not set up for this. I think a lot has improved since then. But
Mhm.
like I was just like, you know, I just want to automate the thing so that I don't have to worry about it every 5 minutes, you know?
Yeah.
and
Yeah, I mean, because it's a whole newsletter, like a designed newsletter, that's quite a bit of HTML, right?
oh yeah, I actually wrote an issue about this a while ago where I basically, when Casey Newton was still on Substack, he
Mm,
had an issue of platformer that I noticed like did a jump in HTML, and I'm just like, this is something that like I've worked really hard on avoiding, and he's just letting it do it. And my thought on the matter was basically, well, why is this? And so I like looked at the code of the issue, and I realized that the issue is not necessarily that what he was doing was like a really heavy code. Like Substack's newsletter wasn't super heavy code. It was that the links were just like massive. And
mm,
because it was a newsletter that had links in it, like he used a lot of them. And so it was very fascinating to me how like, this broken system that we've been using for like the last 30 years to send emails is like kind of kneecapping us from like trying to use stuff in the modern day. And
mhm.
I think that my solution has been, well, let's see what I can get away with.
Well, so I understand what you gain, right? And like the tweakability of every little bit. Is there anything that like you sacrifice not by like not using any particular platform that like is more no code, but is there anything like in general you think you are sacrificing by like doing it DIY, or is it purely gain for you?
Well, I've mentioned this before, and I think that like, I don't really have any qualms with mentioning it here, but like back in late 2017, I was reached out to by Substack when they literally had Bill Bishop, and that was it. And I think it was like Bill Bishop and one other person, and we're just like, come to Substack. And my thought was, well, I built this thing.
Yeah.
It's like I
Your
have this
baby.
thing. I built this design. This is like the thing that I care about. The having the really nice looking email and telling me, oh, throw all that away for the chance to make money. Who wants
Yeah.
that money?
Okay, moving on. I think so. 4 years ago, you wrote that article I quoted from about like feeling limited on the web, right? Do you think I don't think your view has changed because that's I mean it's like a pretty hard opinion, but do you think the web or like the platforms on the web have changed at all to like support more of that like individualism rather than, engagement aggregation?
I think in a lot of ways, I mean, to be honest with you, I think depending on where you look, you know, it may be a little worse, to be honest. I mean,
Yeah.
like I'm just thinking, for example, like, okay, LinkedIn, which is like, you know, it's, let's call it what it is at this point. It's Tumblr for old people.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and basically and basically with that, like you're sort of encouraged into writing in this was very specific shape, where like it has to be a certain length
Mhm.
for the algorithm to pick it up.
Everything's one line.
Yup. And then like you have to have an image. You can't link to anything in it, or the algorithm's gonna just go nuts and like ignore you. And then you have to like mention it in a comment. It's just like you're basically shaping everything that you're creating to the exact parameters a of an algorithm. And
It's like
that's
literal the medium is the message.
yeah, that's absolutely what
Mhm.
it is. And I think that, you know, I think that one of the things that I find really interesting is, you know, I don't think, I think that I don't know how much of your audience is on Mastodon these days.
Mhm.
I imagine that like it's seen as a pretty niche thing, like people
I'm
who
not on
tend
it.
to use
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But like I I basically when I saw that like the trend was like moving that direction, I was actually already on it, but like I wasn't using it super heavy. Like when the trend seemed to be moving in that direction, I invested in it. I put time into it, and like you know, I have like a pretty big follower base there, and like they're super engaged. That place doesn't have an algorithm. I can do
Mhm.
whatever I want if I really feel like it. And I think that like that's kind of what we've been losing in sort of the commercial social media space. Where like everything kind of gets pushed in a certain direction, and you're just kind of stuck with whatever they give you, and it's just
Yeah.
like you know that that totally goes against the idea of 2005. Some 16-year-old accidentally figures out you can put CSS into your MySpace account, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden it leads to this explosion in creativity. Like that's
Yeah. It's such a loss.
it is absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think of that too, like, when I was, 11 or something, I was, like, playing RuneScape, the MMORPG, and I was, like I mean, I had my MySpace, I was, like, designing the web thing, and then, like, RuneScape, I was, like, figuring out how to, like, make forum signatures and avatars in Photoshop and sell them for like in-game gold on online forums. And it was like all this like finding these forums where like I could like engage in that way. And I don't know, even I mean that's not like the exact same thing we're talking about, but just like the internet that was like 20 years ago that was so much more like it naturally led me into these things. And I feel like this is kind of a tangent, but I feel like now it's less about that and more about like kids figuring out how to like drop ship. It's more about monetization using these like no code things than it is about like creating things. Maybe I'm wrong. This is kind of just occurring to me as I say it, but like, do you agree that it's less about like making the thing, making the thing creatively, and more about like making money? Period. I don't know. This was the theory I just made up.
I think a lot about this, it's because it's just like, I'll be straight up, like I think that like in a lot of ways, my approach probably leaves a bit of money on the table. Like
Yeah,
that's just me being straight up honest, and I'm sure it's totally different from what you usually get on a podcast like this.
which is
But
why I wanted to talk to
yeah,
you.
but the thing is, like, I feel like there's a certain integrity to kind of doing things, by the beat of your own drum, and
Mhm.
just hoping that like this cool thing that you're building, you know, has enough direction to it and has enough like of a spark to it that like people will follow along with you. And
Well,
I
wait.
think that
So, wait. Speaking of LinkedIn, this is a kind of what you're saying. A couple weeks ago or so, you had this post. Uh, I just have this one quote from it. Content isn't software. It's not a machine to be optimized. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. There is a tendency to want to optimize content. I mean, there's this
Mhm.
whole thing called search engine optimization, which is literally that.
Yeah.
But I think that like what ends up happening, very often is that this optimization, comes at the cost of the spirit of the thing that you're creating.
Mhm.
It's always about like the keywords versus the voice. And I think that like my argument is essentially, okay, knowing that there is a sort of need to like hit the marks, so to
Mhm.
say, to like build reach on the internet, you know, is there room to like still have you know, the experience of creating, you know, creating with the canvas, and just hoping that like the cool thing that you make is seen as cool by other people. I think that
Yeah.
like, you look at stuff like Patreon, for example, and that kind of experience is a piece of that, but like it's also like, at what point is it just like I'm getting into drawing so I can sell prints on Patreon?
Yeah.
So I think that there's like this tendency to want to create not for the art of it, but for but because they saw some YouTuber that like they really like, and they figured out how to make money, like, you know, taking
Mhm.
apart a phone, or
Not
blowing
for the art
something
of it,
up.
but for the capital of it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. So how many people like I don't need to hear the full story of how you've grown your subscriber base, but I think like part of it is just being around for so long, like Tedium a decade, and then there's the 5 years of short form blog before that. I imagine some of those subscribers came there. So I guess what I'm getting at is like to be in you're if you choose to participate in like an Instagram, a TikTok, Substack, whatever, then you're being the Uber driver for posts where you're like beholden to the system, but maybe you're like accruing an audience quickly. But I feel like what you've done is like you stand outside that and you have accrued an audience, but it's been slower partially because you've stood outside that, right?
Yeah, and one of the things I'll say is like the audience sometimes comes from other places, and
Mm,
I will say that like um one of the things that like I've noticed recently is, okay, you said earlier I had around 12,000 subscribers. I think that's where I'm at right now, so I agree with
mm,
you. But one of the things that I found recently is you know I have an RSS like
mm,
service called FeedPress that I subscribe to, that I use to sort of manage my feeds. And over there, I have like 6,000 RSS readers, which is like, so basically 50% of the audience that I'm sending through email is like reading it through RSS.
yeah.
And then like I have a lot of web readers as well. I sort of am in this situation where like, okay, email is the thing that like I say that I do, but then I have this audience that like reads me not through email. And I
Yeah.
think that like I've not been I think that like I've sort of been pretty laissez-faire about it, like I'm not necessarily like you have to subscribe to like read this. And
Mhm.
I think
What
that
matters is
like
that people just care enough to read it.
exactly, and I think that like that is a really good mindset to have with a lot of this, at least from my perspective.
Mhm.
You sort of lose out on the exclusivity factor of it, but at the same time, it's like, okay, if you want to do something that like you care about, that like has the potential to drive a discussion that like you know is outside is outside of your little bubble, like that seems like a great way to do it. And I guess if you'd like, I can mention. I can mention my whole thing with Google over the last couple of months here.
Oh yeah. Well, so UDM 14, right?
Yeah, UDM 14. I had done this. I had done this blog post. This newsletter issue. I
Mhm.
call it blog post, even though it's a newsletter issue.
It's really interchangeable. I mean, I feel like newsletters are like what blogs were, which are what newsletters were, which are what paper newsletters were. Which I want to get into that in a second too. You've written about that, but okay. Anyways, UDM 14, a blog post
Okay.
newsletter you did a couple months
Yep.
ago.
So basically, Google made this change to a search, and the search is infuriating because you're like, all of a sudden the first thing you read is not like result from the website you actually want to go to, but the search thing that just tells you through AI
Mhm.
what Google thinks you were looking for. And I'm just like, oh man, this is awful. I need to get rid of this. So the first thing I did was I like looked at the URL structure and like found the tag that like that made it so you could go to this web mode that like removes like pretty much all knowledge panels, including
Mhm.
AI. So it's literally just the list of links.
It's just like the 10
And
links per page, like Google used to back in the good old days.
exactly. And so I find this thing, I write a post about it. The post starts going viral outside of my usual reach. And it's just
I think I
like,
read about it in like Neiman Lab or 404 Media's newsletter or something. Yeah, that's how I found it.
yeah, and so like I end up seeing how this thing is going, and I kind of make the realization like, okay, there's an audience of people that like they see this, but they're never going to want to do this because it requires them to go in the settings of their browser, and they're going to be too lazy to want to do it, but they
That
hate
was
the
me.
hate the AI thing.
Yeah.
So I need to figure out a way to like very quickly get these people on the on ramp to search without AI. So I put together this site called UDM 14. I threw the thing together in like an hour. I put I put it on a domain. UDM14.com was somehow open despite the fact it's a 5 character domain. And then I put it online, and within about 10 minutes, there's like 300 concurrent users. And it's like it's 50,000 views in the first 24 hours.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
it was it,
you so how were people getting to it? Had you just updated the link in the blog in your original blog post that then other people had been linking to, or how did that happen?
I basically just shared on Mastodon, Blue Sky, and that site they call Twitter. And
Mm,
I
yeah.
basically put it there. And surprisingly, of the three, Twitter was by far the most popular, and it like drove a lot
People
of this early.
retweeting it and such. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So like it was a very traditional single serving site that like did its job. It served the single thing it was serving, and you know it's been pretty consistently drawing like people in ever since.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about a couple of your other side projects. Specifically, I want to start with mid range, which I think you did 2021 to 2023. The kind of subtitle was "Hot Takes in 30 Minutes or Less," which is a great joke already. But I think the conceit was you'd sit down, set a 30-minute timer, and write. And if you couldn't finish it in 30 minutes, you just wouldn't send it. Does that those are the details, right?
I basically would tell on myself
Mm,
if I passed the 30 minutes. So I basically would have to be like I basically would have to like admit that like, oh no, I took 35 minutes for this one.
yeah.
And like it put a little tension on me because it was just sort of like every morning I had to like I had to hit this goal, and like hopefully I could tell a good story in that period of time.
Were you
But
doing this like
it was
concurrently
it was a
with
very
Tedium
fascinating.
with your day job? Like was this was like one of like five things you would do every day, I imagine, right?
Yeah. pretty much. I like at the time I had a full-time job. I was also doing Tedium twice a week. And then the other 3 days I was doing this because,
Mhm.
you know, who needs a life, you know?
Yeah. Have you heard of the Japanese artist On Kuara?
I've not. Please tell me.
Yeah. So I he's one of my favorite artists, and so this really reminded me of him. So he was like a minimalist artist. Like if you know that museum, Dia Beacon, just upstate New York, he has some work there. And he's most known for this series, The Date Paintings, where he did this for I think like 20, 30 years, where every day he would make a painting that was just like there's like three different sizes. Most of them are like this big, like I don't know, like 12 by 9 inches or something like that. But he would paint the date, and it would be in the format of the country where he was. So it'd be like it could be like Jan dot date, whatever the order, wherever that country was. And that's in white letters. And then the background is like a black, a blue, or a gray, or red. Um, and then he would make a box that he would store each one in that was lined with newspapers from that day, from that place. And if he didn't finish it that day, he would destroy it. So as soon as I read this, I was like, Ernie's just doing Encore date paintings, but as a newsletter. So that's crazy you hadn't heard of it because it was just like to me it was the exact same concept. Um, but yeah, so you should look him up. It's good stuff. But I think one of your last posts about on the from the mid range series. Again, I'm going to paraphrase here, but you wrote about the limits of rhythm with regards to creativity. Um, Basically paraphrasing, you said that when you don't have a distinct deadline, i.e., finish this thing sometimes this month, it's really overwhelming, too much white space. But also when you have a consistent, distinct deadline, i.e., spend 30 minutes every day trying to write this newsletter, that also suffocates you. Um, I think neither one sufficiently reliably produces good creative work. Was the point. And I agree. I've experienced both those things. Um, do you think there's actually a sweet spot for like creativity, for finding that creative rhythm, or is it just like that biological constant struggle for equilibrium?
I think that like over the years I've tried different things. Like I've had lots of different weird formats. Like, you know, people who were subscribing to TD in 2015 know that like they were getting a newsletter at 3 o'clock in the morning because I thought it was funny. Um, you know, I think that I think that that said, in terms of trying to find like the perfect rhythm or the perfect schedule, like, I think a lot about how things ended with short form blog, which was essentially that I had spent like all this time, literal years, like
Hmm.
writing 10 posts a morning, before I like stepped into my day job.
Like every
And
single
like
day.
and these 10 posts were like very short. Like it was like literally it's in the name. And it was this rhythm that I caught myself in that like I found to be I found to work for a while, but eventually things started to shift and like I got older, it was a little harder to stay up a little later. It was it
Hmm.
was, not as consistently, possible to do. And I think that like when I started mid range, I was sort of like, okay, I'm in this spirit where like I've gotten really flabby with my writing because I
Hmm.
like write really long pieces for a couple times a week. So
Yeah.
like let's see if I can find that without like losing the spirit of the other thing.
Force of
And
brevity.
exactly. And so I basically, I think I found that the answer was, ultimately trying to force yourself into a specific shape. It's good for a while, but then if you are too strict about it, it like leads you into a situation where like you're just like throwing stuff on a page because you need to throw
You
stuff
said you
on a
would.
page. Yep.
Yeah. So I you have a couple other side projects going on right now, and then yeah, short form, TDM, mid range, all these things. I was struck by the fact that like maybe it's just looking at all this stuff over the past 10, 15 years, but you are somebody who seems to know when to start projects and when to abandon them. And I think that's something that's hard, something I've struggled with, where it's like, okay, you can have a million ideas, but which one's actually worth starting? Or like this thing, you've been doing this thing in this one rhythm in this groove for however many years, and you're starting to feel burnt out. Like, how do you know when to stop? So, yeah, I guess first question, how do you know when it's time to abandon a project as somebody who seems to have done so quite healthily multiple times over the years?
I think that, for me, in terms of knowing when to stop, and I think in the case of short form blog, I probably should have stopped that at about a year before I actually did.
A year
Not to
before?
say, yeah, not to say that like I didn't do good work in 2014, but it was just like a situation where, you know, it was very clear that like, life was changing, things were stressful.
Yeah.
And I think that I was really in a spot where like I needed to take stock and like reassess. But what I think in the case of mid range, it was very much a situation where you know I I found myself like running into the same mousetrap. Where like because I was like in this position where I had to write something every single day, like inevitably it would like be the obvious thing. Like it would be, and because we're talking about late 2022, early 2023, that obvious thing was Elon Musk buying Twitter.
Mm.
And it was
Mhm.
just like I think that like ultimately what this ended up turning into was I took the spirit of mid range and moved it into the Tedium project, where I do a couple of shorter issues. I do not give myself a specific timeline where they need to be posted. I basically, if I feel like writing at 10 o'clock at night on a Monday, I'm on it.
Yeah.
If I feel like writing at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday, I guess you're getting an issue. I think that
Yeah.
like it's sort of a you
Wait,
know
do you just write them and send them out? You don't, like, schedule them? "Oh, I'm done writing, time to send it?"
Yeah, pretty much. Like
Nice.
I think that like I think that in some ways there's something really fascinating about having that kind of approach because it's just like you know there's this is blogging. Like
Yeah.
you want to embrace the rawness of the form, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah. Well,
But
the spontaneity. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that I think as well, like just kind of getting to your point, like there was one time that I'd actually tried to do something, a side project that was planned to be a side project, and I was going
Are you
to
talking about
like
Next
kind
Geist?
of no, no, I was like that was something
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
I've
sorry
had
to
a lot
interrupt
of
that.
I've tried a lot of things. I've
Yeah.
tried a lot of things over the years, and like, you know, the thing that you just mentioned is what I said. My next thing was for mid range, which obviously I didn't do because
I couldn't find a
I'm.
trace.
But like I'd actually built out a template, but then like
Mhm.
I started to realize like, hey, this is not where I'm at right now. And the
Mm.
thing I ended up actually building was a thing I called Lesser Tedium, which was uh, which was a short version of Tedium that ran on Substack to like
Oh,
leverage the fact that they had just added like the social network, so I could like convince people to join the thing that was off Substack. And I
yeah.
did it for 3 months. I I like made it very short. I made it very sweet. It was an experiment to see if like people would be more interested in short issues of tedium rather than long issues. I found that the answer was no. The long issues are fine.
Nice.
And after 3 months exactly, I shut the thing down.
Yeah. Well, okay, so that brings up a good point, like brevity in newsletters, because that's kind of one of the laws of newslettering, I feel like. And I mean, you, like I mentioned earlier, you'd written this article 2 years ago about the pre-digital newsletter history, and you pulled out like 9 lessons or points from this book this guy Howard Penn Hudson wrote. Who this guy also back in what the 80s was writing a newsletter called The Newsletter on Newsletters, which is everything new is old again, everything old is new again, whatever.
Yep.
Anyways, brevity was the name of the game, was one of the points that you included there. And you read a long newsletter. I also read a long newsletter. And it's obviously common sense, common knowledge that that is not what you want to do. So I think one thing there too is like with brevity doesn't just mean short. It means like condensed and like well edited. I think it does mean short, but I think that's part of it. So question is, When is it okay for newsletters to be long?
I think it's when the expectation is set that you can go long. I
Mhm.
think when people subscribe to Tedium, I like say like
It's
right in
very
it,
clear.
we go
Yeah.
long. I send a I send a list to people like telling people what they should expect from this thing that like is like because like you want to set expectations, but
Mhm.
I think at the same time like you also want to be sure that like what you're doing is sustainable and fun and is you know is creatively fulfilling. And I think that if you just switch up one day and decide that your short newsletter is going to be a very long newsletter, that's a problem.
You're
But
gonna get some churn.
yeah, but if you kind of take this approach that like, okay, you know, I'm going to do it this way. It's kind of anything goes. Like I'm going to intentionally make write subject lines that are obtuse so you don't know exactly what you're getting until you click the thing in the email. Like
Yeah.
it it forces you to like you know not
Lean in a bit.
necessarily lean in a bit, accept that like this guy's going to take you somewhere,
Mhm.
and that somewhere may just be like a 3,000 word piece about how how the safety button works on your jar of salsa, which is an issue I actually wrote at some point.
Yeah, I believe it. Um, okay, the creator economy and this concept I've been hearing more about, the taste economy, right? They both kind of exist within the larger attention economy, let's say. Um, and this is on my mind because somebody on Twitter the other day had made some point about like they're like, why isn't anybody building the tool for distribution? And I'd replied, I was like, I don't think you can solve that. Like, if there's a tool that solves for distribution, it's defeated itself because you can't like not everybody can like if you want distribution, if you want to solve for distribution, go text your friend. That's the solve for distribution, one distribution. But like the one to many distribution, I'm skeptical that it can be solved. Basically, my reply was some version of that. And then this guy said, I don't think it's a zero sum game. I disagree. I think it is a zero sum game. I'm curious to hear what you think because I think like let's say with newsletters, right? Like which are only one like there's only so much attention anybody can give any type of informational any type of media in their day to day. And let's say with newsletters specifically, I think it's like if let's say if you're writing an English language newsletter, your market is people who speak the English language, who are online, who have an email account, and more specifically, they're probably somebody who has to use email for work. Otherwise, you're probably not checking it that much. And then those people, on average, probably have enough time for one newsletter a day. Um, so I guess the question is like, do you think it is a zero sum game or not in the attention economy?
I think one thing that I have a couple thoughts about this.
Yeah.
One, to kind of touch on the point that you were making about like whether distribution is a nut that can be cracked. um I would recommend taking a good look right now at yeah at what was happening around ActivityPub. It's a
Mm.
uh, it's a distribution,
Fediverse, right?
Fediverse distribution mechanism. There's some work that's being done on this front. You know, uh, I will I will admit it's by Ghost. That like is definitely is definitely worth keeping an eye on because it's
Mm.
sort of working on this specific kind of problem in terms of like making it so that when somebody posts something, it gets distributed. You can follow people, that are distributing in this method. It's very, you know, it's very interesting to see what's going on with that.
Mhm.
You know, does it solve the problem? I'm hopeful that like maybe it does something, but we've seen a lot of this before. Let's
Yeah.
let on that point.
Well, that's well,
On
so
zero,
that's sorry, to before we move on to the next point, I think that's kinda my thing though, is that, like, any new platform or new solution does solve it, but within a matter of months to years, people find a way to dominate that with like with how whatever marketing techniques, and then it becomes they kind of crowd out the other people who don't have the time or money to like spend on like, you know, uh, pushing out volume or like whatever on that channel. So it's like that's kind of my where I was landing is like you can solve for it, but only for a short period of time with a new platform. And maybe you're right with like ActivityPub. That's I need to look more into it. It's like something I keep hearing about, but I haven't looked into.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that that's a fair point. And one
Mhm.
thing that I'll say in in the decade that I've been doing this, like almost a full decade,
Mhm.
is that there's just been a tendency to, as more people get into this, like they get better at they get better at different things than you're good at. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I got into this as a writer and journalist and creative person who wanted to like write and journalist
Yes.
and create. And I run a newsletter group
Yes.
and yeah, and it's called Newsletter Nerds.
On
It's on
Facebook.
Facebook. It's not really super active these days because Facebook is
One
kind of
post in the past
offline.
month. I've
Yep,
done
pretty
my
much.
research.
You've done your research. Good job. I but there's a point where like somebody tried to post like some growth hacking scheme
Mhm.
on it, and it was very aggressive and very obvious what they were trying to do. Um, it was somebody somebody pretty well known in the newsletter space actually, um, and had blocked the person, and then somebody else that they knew posted it again, and it was just like, oh, so like what's ultimately happening here is like people who are really good at growth
And
going,
shitification.
are going to start crowding out people that are are just trying to do this because they enjoy doing it. And
Yeah.
I'm not I'm not necessarily saying that that's everybody. I'm not necessarily like trying to name names or like criticize anybody about it. I just think that like that zero sum game point that you're getting to, that is the version of it that I think that I've seen in this space of the last decade. And I'm sort of this guy like waving the tiny little flag for like for like just being creative and trying to do
Yeah.
it in a way that like isn't about like results with all else. But that said, it would be nice if I had a couple more people in my corner on that front. Like
Yeah.
I know that they're out there. I've talked to plenty of them. But it's always good to get a couple more.
Well, so no, so this is great. I think like one of my other, theories of what is a creator is that like they're all there's it's a Venn diagram, right? And there's like so a creator to be successful as a creator online, it's a mix of the creative skills and the business skills or the marketing skills. And I think like the way you're describing yourself is very much in the creative skills bucket, right? But I think um when it becomes more crowded, these things, and more people are doing like growth hacky stuff, whatever, um you like somebody like you maybe who's just starting out, who like the version of you who's like launched Tedium today, right? Like you are then forced to like either learn some of those more marketing business skills or partner with somebody who has. And I think like both of these things have become oversaturated, but then it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with like the kid who's trying to make money instead of make the thing for art's sake, right? So I think like more people maybe get interested in purely the monetization side rather than the creative side. And maybe it's a thing where like that continues happening until there's just kind of a crash, a course correction because like there's not enough quality. And then the quality kind of just starts rising to the top because like it's just so like there's so much low quality stuff. I don't know. That which is kind of just an obvious, I think, kind of it's the pendulum swings and the pendulum swings back kind of thing. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think so much of that is really true. Like
Mhm.
I think that when I started doing this, it was like there are a couple of newsletters that I still know are very active that like were around back then, but they're they're very small parts of the overall pie. Like a lot of those people like from that era are still kind of around, but
Mhm.
it's tough like when you're getting into it. Like it's sort of like people who start like a YouTube channel now to talk about video games. There's so
Yeah.
many YouTube channels about video games that like it's impossible to stand out unless you like you hit all the levers, you like talk about like the very newsiest newsy things, you have a lot of money to throw at the problem, and you're willing to like take other creators down in the process. We
Yeah.
haven't gotten to the create take the other creators down part in the
The
newsletter space,
hostile
I don't think.
takeovers, as it were.
Yeah, but I do think that like we're sort of in the situation where there's so many people that like want to get into the space that maybe aren't starting with the same motivations that
Yeah.
I did, or
Mhm.
people who started in 2015 or 2016 or even 2017 did. And I think that that's not necessarily healthy for this space,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I understand it because, like you said, it's sort of a situation where you know, as things become more saturated, you know, the sponge can only hold so much.
Yeah, exactly. So, what is one thing that you're very optimistic about in the newsletter world and one thing you're pessimistic about?
I think in terms of what I'm optimistic about, I think I'm optimistic that, you know, there will be there will be creators like that come, that come after me, that come after, what we currently have that are doing really inventive things that like will keep pushing that space forward, where it won't necessarily just be like the same three types of newsletters for everything, where it will be like something that like builds and creates like another another form of another form of the medium. Like I think that like
Yeah.
there's plenty of room to do that because we have better tools than we did in 2015 when I started. Like fact of matter, like the fact that there's so many options to send a newsletter now. Beehive being one of them. I think that is, it's really, it really opens up the space to a lot of different types of creators. Um, I think the thing that I'm pessimistic about is, there's always the risk of like, you know, the trend chasers that you sort of
Mhm.
see online, like exploiting what is a good thing for a lot of people in the community for sort of their own personal sake. Which is not to say that like I'm necessarily criticizing anybody for that. I'm just more like thinking about okay, well, you know, there's a lot
Well,
of
it sounds like you're saying the same thing for both. The good thing and the bad thing are both the higher level of access.
yeah. I mean, it is kind of that. Like the thing is, there is a higher level of access. It like makes it so that it democratizes it. But then there's also the situation where because there's more democracy and because it's easier to like build a thing, like it leads to it leads to people that are like, subscribe to my Web3 newsletter, and like they just build up the biggest list, and like once the next thing shows up, like they move that list to the AI newsletter. Like
Mhm. Lack of
it's not,
integrity.
yeah. I think that that's sort of it, and I realize that like you know it's not really a great you know great creative growth storyline to be like, knock that off. But
Yeah.
I think at the same time though, like there's a need to like keep in mind that integrity does matter in this space because people need to know that like the people that they read, you know, do they do understand that like
Yeah.
this is not just like this is not just like a game for them. Like they want to ensure that like they're getting a quality product, and it's like they're not just they're not being thrown under the bus for the sake of like an easy buck.
Yeah. No, that's good. I agree with that. I think integrity is something that gets thrown under the bus itself a lot.
Yep.
Okay, last question then is like, what's what's on your mind for the next couple years, year or two? You're about to hit a decade come January. Is yep, Tedium will then have survived twice as long as short form blog. Do you have like ambitious new project plans, or are you kind of just you're happy where you're at and you're continuing a pace?
I think that like one thing that I'm kind of thinking about, and I'm not necessarily saying that like I have anything like firmly set in plans, but I think that like a lot of the strategy that I've learned over the last decade, like I would like to be able to take that know, to like a more niche approach. Like basically try to target a more niche audience that like it makes sense for. And maybe do more of the monetization stuff for that to like make it like, a
Mhm.
viable, you know, a viable thing that doesn't have to like, lean on, random viralness or, like
Yeah.
luck of the
Is it
draw.
wait, is it as a business, is it like sustaining itself plus a little bit right now, or is it like are you breaking even on your time, do you feel? Is it sustainable for you right now? Is the question, I guess.
I mean, I think it's, I would say that it's breaking even in terms of like I make a profit off of it, and
Mm,
it's, like I think that like it's not like the main thing. Is that like the main thing that I do? Like I have a freelance journalism career,
yeah.
and in many ways, it's like a great inroad to like
It's a calling card. It's
getting.
a business card.
It's a great calling card to be like, hey, I've done this thing that's been featured all these places, and like I've had a lot of success with it. But I think I think at the same time, like I'm not trying to like turn it into this like $10 million business. I'm just trying to like make it something that like is a successful thing creatively as well as
You're not trying
something.
to build a media empire. You're just trying to sustain a column on the newsletter internet.
Exactly. And that's, maybe that doesn't make me ambitious enough. Maybe it makes me like a bit old school, but whatever.
Well,
It's
I think no, I think for most people, that's the move, honestly. Like I was talking to Kate Lindsay from Embedded a couple weeks ago. And just kind of the same for her. She was very upfront. She was like, "Look, I'll tell you, I make $1,500 to $3,000 a month through subscription revenue, but it's like this is more about something that is consistent, and then I have my freelance journalism career." I think the more I think about like I'm interested in this idea of the newsletter internet and everybody being a columnist on it, whether or not you're like doing it fully independently as you are, whether or not you're like paying for software to do it, whether that's Beehive or Ghost or MailChimp, or if it's Substack. And Substack is like, I feel like with Substack, it's like, it's fully a media company where they just, they take a cut. Anyways, my point being, I think it's good to be a columnist on the newsletter internet, which just sounds like
Yeah,
what you're doing.
I think that that's very much what I'm trying to do. And I think the other thing that I'll say though is like, you know, one thing I think a lot about, kind of going back to, know, the forebears of this industry, Mr. Howard Penn Hudson. One of the things that I found really interesting about, reading his book and then doing research on him was while he was clearly writing for a different medium, like his thought process around it is very similar to what you see today. Like it's a lot of find the right niche,
Mhm.
try to engage those people, build a model, build things that like support that model, and I think that like I love, I kind of like the idea that like, okay, I built this thing that is just like sort of amorphous and weird and fun. But I also think that like it would also be interesting at some point to build something that's tightly focused
Yeah.
and does specific storytelling that is beneficial to a very narrow and specific audience. I think that like is something I'd like to look into at some point. I'm not saying it's going to be like, I have a launch coming in a month.
It's not your
It's
Q3 goal. Yeah.
it's not my Q3 goal, but I think that but I think if I do that, I don't want to like just do it like with, you know, with the random newsletter. I want to like put the
Mhm.
same mindset I've put into Tedium, that being like the willingness to like do the work to build up to that versus versus just trying to build this thing that's like I started an account, like I now have a newsletter, like there has to be more
Yeah.
strategy to it than that,
Yeah. Planning, a real editorial point of view. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Where should people go to find you and your work?
You can find me at tdm.co. I've been doing it for a long time. I have a lot of side projects I'm sure you've heard, but that said, the place where you're going to find me mostly is TDM.
That's the place to go. All right. This has been the Creator Spotlight Podcast. Ernie Smith has been our guest today, and I have been your host, Francis Asir. I will see you next week.